To find the solutions for this quadratic inequality, we need to move the 9x to the other side first by subtracting 9x to both sides. So now my inequality will be negative 3x squared plus 14x minus 8 less than or equal to 0. So because my inequality is less than or equal to 0, then I know that I want the negative part of the graph. So that's part of the parabola that is going to be below the x-axis, where all your y values or the result is going to be negative, which is less than or equal to 0. So in order to graph this parabola, the first thing we need to do is to find the roots. And to find the roots, we need to set this inequality equal to 0. And to solve this equation, you can solve it by factoring, completing the square, or using the quadratic formula. So here we're going to use the quadratic formula, which is negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and then all over 2 times a, where b is the number in front of x, so that's 14 and 14. A is the number in front of x squared, so that's negative 3. And then c is the constant, so that's negative 8. So now we're going to simplify this, so we have negative 14 plus or minus square root of 14 squared is 196. Negative 4 times negative 3 is 12 times negative 8, so that's negative 96 over negative 6. And this is the same thing as negative 14 plus or minus 196 minus 96 is 100. And square root of 100 is 10. So therefore we have negative 14 plus 10, that's negative 4 over negative 6. And then negative 14 minus 10 is negative 24 over negative 6. So therefore the roots for this parabola is at 4 over 6, the same thing as 2/3. And then negative 24 divided by negative 6 is positive 4. So now we know the roots. Now we can graph this parabola. So 2/3 come first. So 2/3 is somewhere here and 4 is here. And the next thing we need to figure out is whether or not this parabola opens up or down. So since our a value is negative, we know our parabola is going to open down. And it's going to have a maximum point if it opens down. And I'm going to use a solid parabola because we have that equal bar at the bottom here. So we are going to draw a solid parabola. And again, because my inequality here is less than or equal to 0, so we want the negative portion of the graph. So the negative part of the graph is where the graph is below the x-axis. So as you can see, for the first part of the graph is on the left side of 2/3, so therefore it tells you that the solution for this quadratic inequality is when all your x values are less than or equal to 2/3, or for the second part of the graph, that's on the right side of 4, so or x is greater than or equal to 4. And if you want to write your answer in the interval notation, you can say that because the first part of the graph is on the left side, so you start with negative infinity to 2/3, and you use a bracket because of the equal bar. Union means or, and then you start at 4, and it goes to positive infinity. And that's the answer in the interval notation. Here is another example of how we solve quadratic inequalities. So the first step again is to move all the terms to the other side by subtracting 7x here and adding 6 to both sides. So now my quadratic inequality will become negative 3x squared minus 7x. Negative 8 plus 6 is negative 2, and that's greater than 0. So now my inequality is greater than 0, so this tells you that your solutions will be located above the x-axis. That's where the positive part of the graph is located. So the first thing we need to do to graph this parabola is to find the roots by setting this equal to 0. And you can find the roots of this parabola by completing the square, factoring, or using the quadratic formula. So we're going to use the quadratic formula here again. So we have negative b plus or minus square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a, where b is the number in front of x, so that's negative 7. A is the number in front of x squared, so that's negative 3. And c is the constant, so that's negative 2. And now we're going to simplify this, so we have negative 7 is the same thing as positive 7, plus or minus square root of negative 7 squared is 49. Negative 4 times negative 3 is 12 times negative 2, that's negative 24, all over 2 times negative 3, which is negative 6. And this is equivalent to 7 plus or minus 49 minus 24 is 25, and square root of 25 is 5 over negative 6. And this is the same thing as 7 plus 5, which is 12 over negative 6, and 7 minus 5, which is 2 over negative 6. And so the roots for this parabola is at negative 2 and negative 1/3. So now I know my roots, I can graph this parabola. My roots are located at negative 1/3 and negative 2. The next thing we need to figure out is whether this parabola opens up or down. Since our a value is negative, we know this parabola is going to have a maximum point and it's going to open down. And because my inequality is just greater than, so you have to use a dashed parabola. And now we know the solutions for this quadratic inequality is the positive portion of the graph. So that's where the graph sits above the x-axis. And as you can see, for this part of the graph, your solutions will be between negative 2 and negative 1/3. So negative 2 less than x less than negative 1/3. And the answer in the interval form is x value, use parentheses because it's just greater than, so it's between negative 2 and negative 1/3.